Organizations are a bottomless pit of need. It will never be enough. You're going to do the best you can. What is in your control as a people leader in terms of how you respond? You cannot control anybody's reaction, no matter how well you do this. And you will never be able to keep up. So I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to prioritize what I can. And I'm going to have to get comfortable, more comfortable, tolerating the discomfort of not being able to get it all done. But that is not a reflection on my skill. That's just a reality.
Welcome to Work Matters, where we explore what leaders can do to make work more productive, valuable, meaningful, and impactful. I am your host, Thomas Bertels. In today's episode of the Work Matters podcast, we're taking a closer look at change leadership. And my guest is Elizabeth Moran. Elizabeth is an executive coach and change leadership expert. She is the founder of Elizabeth Moran Transformation, and prior to that held senior HR leadership roles at ADP, Bloomberg, Lehman Brothers, Getty Images, Time Inc., and Gap. Elizabeth holds a master's and doctoral degree in clinical psychology, and she is the author of Forward, a playbook grounded in neuroscience to support leaders through change. In our conversation, we explore why so many leaders struggle with change, how insights from neuroscience can help leaders become more effective change leaders, what some typical mistakes leaders make when leading change, how leaders can manage their own discomfort with change, and what the key ingredients are for making real change happen. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Elizabeth, welcome to the show. You are an expert on change leadership, but I also know that you had real HR leadership roles before. How did you end up in the space of change leadership?
I was at Lehman Brothers and Bloomberg, and most recently in my corporate life, heading up all global people leader and team development at ADP. And throughout all of those experiences, I was involved in supporting my clients through change. A couple of things I saw consistently. One is the idea of change management or change leadership was very much of this amorphous concept that one was hard to implement as advertised, do all these steps. And two, was very hard for people to measure. So it was this idea of this practical application of what actually do I need to do? And then how do I know I'm on the right track or doing it well? So my goal through all of that has been, as I've worked with leaders, I developed an approach. And again, a lot of it's not new, but my goal was, how do I titrate out the most important things an organization can do from a project aspect? How do I simplify that? So kind of these are the essentials. And then from a people standpoint, how do I help leaders feel more confidence and ease when they have to have those tough conversations? And I think I hope my more unique contribution is, one, trying to simplify and make very practical a topic that was complex. One, and two, bringing in neuroscience. So I'm a bit of a nerd and a geek. And again, I always have a little asterisk that we're always learning new things all the time about the brain. But I take 5 concepts that most people leaders love to hear about, because it's like, oh, right. Okay. So it's me. Well, it's not just me. This is how human beings react to change. And then once you understand that, practically, what can you do to go with that to make it more likely that, one, your people will get on board with the change faster? And when they are struggling, you can have a conversation with them. And a lot of it is just being curious, so that you can actually help them make that decision to get on board. So I've been fascinated with that. And then when I left corporate, I wrote the book called Forward, Leading Your Team Through Change, which is very much, no matter what your organization is doing with change, I wanted a playbook for people leaders. Ultimately, when they had to have those tough conversations, again, they could feel, even if they were nervous and uncomfortable, they could just feel like they have a resource to use to have those. So as an example, here are the 4 toughest questions you might get from people when there's a change. And then I have scripts that at least people can start from. So I've heard that that is actually one of the things that people find most helpful. That's how I got into this space. Perennial challenge, and hopefully lean to offer something that's truly practical for folks.
Why do so many people struggle with change? Is it a lack of training? What is holding so many leaders back?
Well, I think that's an amazing question. So if we think about the external context first, I think there is definitely, I think many people are experiencing a lot more change, more frequent, multiple changes happening at once. So leaders are already in a situation where there isn't a lot of stability. The other thing is internally, from a neuroscience perspective, we bottom line are hardwired to view any type of change in our external world as a threat. And so what happens is you have leaders who, given all the changes that are happening, and this is what organizational life is, you as a people leader, you and your team have to implement change or changes that most of the time you didn't initiate. And that is difficult. So the leader is not only oftentimes dealing with their own reaction when a change happens, their own emotional reaction, and it's usually some type of fight or flight reaction. They're dealing with their teams as well. And from a neuroscience perspective, this is instinctual. This is what keeps us safe. But it's very frustrating as a leader when you're constantly bumping up against what you view as resistance all the time. And so, again, we can get more in depth, but this is what makes it hard and still hard.
One of the things I like about your book is that you frame resistance as wisdom. And I think you use this term wisdom 2.0. Say a little bit more about that.
So, first, from a neuroscience perspective, we have this thing called negativity bias. And again, that simply is we are hardwired to give at least three times more psychological weight to the negative than the positive. What that means is over time, people get into the habit. And when I really got this, it was life-changing for me. We are in the habit of really going towards what could go wrong much more often than what can go right. In a weird way, the what could go wrong, the negative interpretation of any situation starts to feel right, like it's the right thing. That's not because it's actually true, because like everything, right? It's a future event. We don't know. As best we can say is at a certain point, it's neutral information, right? But our brain goes to how bad it can be. So that is usually the bottom line of where resistance comes from. One of the first things that leaders can do for themselves and others is view it as simply normal. These are just people with healthy working brains. And bottom line, moving from a mentality that says resistance is a problem to resistance are simply concerns that haven't been addressed yet. Having said that, when you view that from that perspective, it becomes possible to engage it in a way that might be helpful. And in the book, I have here are the 8 most common reasons you resist a change. So for instance, we tried this before in the past and it failed. If, as I say, if you tried it in the past and it failed, there's wisdom there. And so wisdom 2.0 is, how do you take that and then move it to something where you're not ignoring the reasons that you or your team might resist a change, but you're going to engage it in a way that says, okay, is what we're concerned about truly a fact right now or a possibility? So in that case, wisdom 2.0 would be, all right, has something changed inside the organization or externally that may make this idea more doable now? If you still think that answer is no, then it becomes, okay, do the people leading the change, are they aware that you tried it in the past? Or are they aware of the reasons why it didn't work? And how can you and your team bring that information forward in a helpful way where you're trying to say, hey, we support the change. We're trying to support the change, but we're seeing these obstacles that are going to get in our way. So again, not saying we won't move forward with it, but we would love to discuss some of these challenges so that if they come up, we can move through them with greater ease. I think one of the things we talked about in the past was that is a wonderful way for your team to become engaged. We have our normal human reaction to when a change happens. Oh, it's an instant, wait, right? So that's normal. But then at that point, how do you engage them where they feel like, no, I do see there's a real problem. I want to bring it forward. I want to believe that somebody else has the information because I feel like I'm doing my job. If I ignore a challenge, it's going to make my life more difficult than everybody else's. So it oftentimes is uncomfortable to have these conversations. But as we said, when you treat it as wisdom, the thing that's most problematic for people leaders, and especially those higher level up, once the people at a higher level have announced a change, they've already decided to change. They've had time to view the different reasons why we're doing this. They might have had different possibilities. And so when they announce it, they're already on board. They forget that everybody else is hearing it for the first time. So that's one level of frustration that they have. So the first is that. Then when you're this people leader, right, you're trying to lead through the change, you're also trying to process it, trying to get on board, but then also trying to engage your people. So there's multiple things happening here, but if everybody can review that, oftentimes resistance is okay when it's our resistance, but as soon as it's somebody else's, we get frustrated by it. And again, from a neuroscience perspective, one of the most simple things you can do as a leader is move from resistance as a problem to resistance or simply concerns that haven't been addressed yet. It's very hard to stay in frustration and be in curiosity at the same time.
I really like your approach because one thing that I think is really intriguing about it is that you don't look at it as, hey, these are tools that help you get other people to do what you want to do. But it really starts with yourself, right? With your own mindset. And I think you also mentioned, I think earlier, that sometimes leaders themselves are conflicted about these changes, right? So the first person they have to convince, right, is probably themselves. So I think that's really true. The other point I really love is, as you said, the senior people who make the decisions, they have been sitting in this for the last 6 months. So for them, making the decision to make the change is the end point of the journey. But for everybody else, it's the start point. Yes. I think a lot of leaders struggle with delivering changes that they don't themselves support or maybe don't think it's a good idea. So how do you suggest leaders handle that dilemma, right? That you have to sell something that maybe yourself are not that bought into?
That's a great point. This myth that you have to be 100% on board to lead through it is a myth. But most leaders feel inauthentic when they have discomfort and then trying to get people on board. The best way to handle that ultimately is to start with yourself. Listen to both your reasons, your concerns. And if you start with yourself, I guarantee most of the time your concerns will be the same concerns that your people have. For instance, I know myself, and I'm sure you as well, there have been times I knew the change wasn't necessarily going to be good for us. Maybe there was something that was going to be downsized. So I tried to use my authenticity, which is my job is one, I can't make the decision for anybody else. Two, logically, if the train has left the station, the train has left the station. And if I am not morally opposed to a change, then I have to find some way to lead through it. And the third thing is my ability to bring my authenticity forward in a thoughtful way. So, for instance, I would say to my people, I have concerns about this too. I'm a little uncomfortable as well. So, why don't we have a conversation as a team? One, what is it we're struggling with? Right? Two, what are the nuggets in there that we feel like, is there any way as a team we can use our strengths to bring these forward to see if we can influence? And usually you don't do that by being frustrated and angry, though that's, how perfectly fine to feel that, but just how do you communicate that in a thoughtful way? And then three, as a team, saying really, which is true, we have all been through a number of changes personally or professionally in the past where initially we're not on board. And oftentimes things weren't as bad as we thought. Now, listen, I was at Lehman Brothers. That didn't end well for anybody who worked there. So that was a tough change. But it was also, if I'm honest, it was a rerouting opportunity. I didn't see it at the time. I was scared and I was upset because I had loved my job. But it was what it was. And I had learned from a previous situation where I got fired. I know, shocking. And I spiraled out in anxiety. And so I got a redo almost again, a 2.0 to say, what did I do in the past that was helpful and what wasn't? And it was a huge, powerful experience for me to say, I control my internal state. Now, that doesn't mean I don't get upset, right? And that's perfectly fine. But how long I choose to stay in that is my choice. I have the power to say, along this journey, do I want to feel miserable or do I want to feel some element of peace? So it's, as a leader, one, acknowledging the discomfort that you feel. Two, trying to look at it and involve your team and be authentic about that. And then three, what are the things that are in our control? And then how do we want to communicate if we do have concerns in a way that makes it more likely for people to hear us, to give us what we need? We have these networks that work together. They're called networks in our brain, of parts of our brain that work together. So we have the analytic network, and the analytic network is really designed to solve problems, analyze data, keep to timelines, so the technical project aspects of a change. And then you have the empathetic network. And the empathetic network is two things primarily. One is absolutely, it makes us more responsive to the verbal and the nonverbal cues that people give us. The other is it makes us more open to innovation because you're able almost to pick your head up off the details and then look at the bigger picture. The challenge is when we are in one, it actively suppresses the other. So this is one of the things that still make change management so difficult for leaders, is that most organizations reward people leaders for the analytic network activities. And then you might have people who are just more minded. So if you think about Myers-Briggs or something, those that have a preference for thinking versus feeling. The analytic network activities are super important when it comes to change, but the part that they struggle with most, and most organizations keep getting wrong, is that human, as we talked about, the human connection, is being able to go into the empathetic network activities. So the best change leaders can toggle between the two, and you have to have enough awareness in the moment, which is very difficult when leaders, and again, I struggle with this too. When I'm goal oriented, I'm like not paying attention to the people stuff. So for those people who, you have to be able to take a pause and realize giving people more information or telling them is not helpful right now. I need to pause and ask. So again, that curiosity, and it takes maybe 5 or 6 minutes, right? So a lot of times leaders think like, oh, they're going to be slowed down, and right, they get really upset and nervous because let's face it, when somebody has an emotional reaction in front of us, we're going into fight or flight. So you have to be able to take a pause, tolerate that discomfort, and then use that analytic as well, that's there, but then move into the empathetic network. That's where curiosity comes from. I'm not sure that answered your question. I might have gone off on a tangent, but this is then when leaders know themselves, and then in that moment, it's almost like you need to pause, because we're asking not only people leaders, as we talked about, but all other people to override their natural instinct. But once you have practice doing that, and this is what I've developed over time, right? I've had a lot of practice. So for me, I don't mind a difficult conversation. I might still be uncomfortable, and that's okay, but I've developed enough practice in that area that I have an approach, which I share in the book, which is oftentimes really going into curiosity.
I really like that last point too, because it really looks as changed like a two-way street. And at the very least, we got to be able to hear those concerns. And maybe sometimes people have ideas for how to address them too. I feel like sometimes when we look at change management, we have this idea that
We got all these great changes and just these ungrateful humanoids, right? They just reject a lot of them. And I think the reality that I see in a lot of organizations is that some of these ideas are really terrible ideas. Or they're intellectually good ideas, but they're just not practical. Or the presumed benefit, we're going to centralize all the decision making globally, that has some real downsides that we should really consider. It's not just like everything is net better off. And I think it's really important in those situations to have that feedback loop, to know
Yeah.
when it is a bad idea and maybe hit the pause button. What are some mistakes that you see leaders make when it comes to leading change?
I'm going to focus, I guess, both on ultimately the larger organization and then the people leader. So the larger organization's biggest mistake is not spending enough time talking to people about why we're making this change. And I think understanding that, as we talked about, when you announce a change, the senior people have already decided to change, not realizing that you need to give people some time. So they, even when you announce it, they're going to instantly go into, what does this mean for me? And again, 3 times more psychological weight to the negative, they're going to focus on all what's wrong. And so to make room for normalizing most people's reaction at first, unless you're giving everybody a $20,000 raise, is going to be, they're going to focus on the negative. So treat that as normal. Prepare for that. There's no problem here, right? So that's, I'd say, the 2 biggest mistakes. That is one, the giving people understanding, giving people when they communicate, and then creating very normal opportunities for people. Like, you want to hear their concerns. You all pick this apart, and making it okay for people to do that, because as you said, there's could be a lot of good data there. The people leader themselves, it is continuing to go into a tell approach. Tell. When somebody has a tough question, right, that they start telling and debating, and that is going into an analytic network, tell versus, why don't I pause and be curious? Because when people have a tough reaction, leaders are like, oh my God, you're getting in my way. I've got to lead through this. And maybe that individual is bringing up their own concern that they haven't found a good way to deal with. So I'll give you an example. I had a team member who came to me and said, am I going to lose my job? And the organization at that time was going through layoffs. Our group wasn't. But as soon as she asked me that question, I went into all my past legal and HR trainings about what I could say and not say. And then I remembered, oh, right, I am HR, so let me actually practice what I coached leaders on. But even there, in that moment, I went into fight or flight. But I was like, okay, take a deep breath. This is one of those moments. Great. Okay. So I said to her, I think I understand why you're asking that question, but could you tell me more about why is this coming up for you now? And she said, the other organizations I've been part of, it was always last in, first out was the policy, and I'm the last member to join the team. Now, that was great information. I never would have thought of that. I could have jumped in at that moment and said, no, we don't have any layoff plans right now. But I didn't, because I wanted to make sure what else is going on. Are there rumors, right? Is there anything else? So took another minute and said, hey, that's really helpful. Thank you. Is there anything else? And she said, well, my partner right now isn't working. And so I am the primary breadwinner. And I was like, okay. And I'm like, all right, well, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So at that point, then I gave information. I said, I am not aware of any layoffs planned. You know, I can't guarantee anything, but not in our group. But should that happen, here is how this organization handles it. Here's how I would handle it with you. What we're trying to do in that moment with anybody is the measure of successful, right? I think change leadership is not happiness. That's great when that happens. It's clarity. And why? The other neuroscience concept is our brains hate uncertainty more than anything. And so oftentimes that discomfort is also what causes people, when they don't have information, that goes into fight or flight. Like, that triggers the negativity bias. So being able even to clarify with somebody what we know and what we don't know. So being able to say, it's normal. Of course, we don't know, and that is uncomfortable. But what I said is, not knowing that information now, is that preventing you from doing your job? She said no. Okay. So then I tried to put her back into her strengths. And again, the other concept neuroscience wise is optimism, right? So optimism isn't about ignoring challenges. It's trying to free a brain that might be stuck in the negativity bias of what's going to be wrong. And so I said, tell me about, what are you enjoying about your job right now? What is working? What are the projects you're working on? I shared how much I appreciated the value and what she brings to the team. So she left that, clear about what we were unclear about, right? But also feeling supported, that she was valued. So that, in terms of what leaders can do, instead of being afraid in that conversation because they don't have an answer, or it's a hard question, shutting that down, the solution there is to try to use that as an opportunity to open up. Even if you don't have an answer, really important for you to tell somebody, I don't have that answer right now, but when I do, here's how I plan to handle it.
I think that's really useful because a lot of the harder changes are the ones that, right? Oftentimes people try to keep under wraps. We're doing a big layoff,
Yes.
or what's the new org chart going to look like? Who's going to have a job? Who doesn't? And I find those exercises interesting because on the one side, it always leaks out somewhere, right? People always kind of
Yes.
like figure out, like,
100%.
what's going on. The rumor mill gets going. They oftentimes imagine it actually being much worse than it is. And it also leaves leaders stranded in this in-between phase where I know a little bit, but I can't tell you, which I think is very uncomfortable.
Yes. Exactly. I was having a conversation with some leaders too, and that's exactly what they said. And I said, okay. But again, look at the discomfort. Your job oftentimes is to tolerate that. So see if there's a negative voice inside that's saying, oh, you're lying, you're not being truthful, because that is difficult. One of the best ways I heard a leader just get out in front of that right away was, he said, there are things I can tell you because I can tell you we know them. There are things I can't tell you because we don't know them yet, but here's how I'm trying to manage that. As I said, that's clarity. When somebody has a difficult question that you don't have an answer to, you can acknowledge and say, hey, that's a great question. If I was in your shoes, very powerful words a leader can use. If I was in your shoes, I'd feel the same way. And I have the same question. I wish we had the answers. We don't. And there are going to be things I can't tell you because I can't tell you. And I think most people understand that that's a reality of organizational life. It's okay to say that, right? It's okay. And at some point, if they can, the things shall be revealed. But that, to your point, it does make leaders very uncomfortable because many of them feel like they're being inauthentic. But again, it's okay to say that. And then it's okay to say specifically, I know it's uncomfortable not knowing, but is that discomfort, any of that discomfort or not knowing, preventing you from doing your job today? Most of the time, the answer will be like, no, it's not preventing me. I just wish I had an answer. And then you can empathize and say, yeah, absolutely. Our brains hate uncertainty more than anything. It's a threat, right? But it's very important to say deep breaths. Not knowing doesn't mean a catastrophe is about to happen, which is what our brains will tell us. Not knowing is not knowing. It's neutral. There was a really fascinating study that they did using hooking people up to an fMRI, the brain scan. What they discovered is when people are already in uncertainty, 75% of the time they mispredicted when a bad thing was going to happen. So in other words, they were flashing images, and before the image even came up, people were like, bad, it's bad, it's bad, right? Because we're in discomfort, our brain signals there's something wrong. So this is the self-development and the self-awareness that many humans now are getting a ton of practice to have to take a pause to say, listen, is in this moment, is there something bad now? No. Okay. And then it's, how do we then trust that we've been in this place before? What are our strengths? So the best thing a leader can do is not travel down the fear road, but to say, I can't tell you what's going to happen. Maybe we'll all lose our jobs. I don't know. That might happen. But what I do know is we have a lot of care here, and I knew we can support it. But that, again, as Mark Twain says, there's been many terrible things in my life, most of which have never happened. So how do we just continue to bring ourselves back and say, in this moment, it's okay. How do I get my brain out of terror and fear and remember what it is? Why am I doing this? What's my opportunity as a people leader to influence others? I knew at Lehman Brothers, I was going to be losing my job. And so what I specifically did was I actively went out to try to help my colleagues. We all helped each other. Even if there was a job that I was competing for with somebody else, I would share it. I would provide people contacts. Being of service is a resilience building opportunity. How do I want to be remembered? How do I want to lead through this time? Do I want to go into fear and anger? Not criticizing my fear and anger. It's okay. But how long do I want to stay in it? And do I have an opportunity to be of service for other people? Most of the leaders I work with, almost all of them, that they get to that point. So it's being kind to yourself, it's being gentle, it's normalizing your reactions, and then remembering who you are and your strengths.
A question for you. Is there value in changing often, constantly, versus shooting for long periods of stability interrupted by enormous change? Is change leadership a muscle that gets stronger the more we exercise it? Or is there a finite capacity for change that we have? So we got to really dole it out and only when necessary. What's your perspective?
So I'll answer that question by saying yes. So they're both true. We're all getting plenty of practice. But I think where it becomes detrimental is the pace and the amount. So one of the things we talked about before is leaders trying to create more stability for themselves. And it's ultimately figuring out what we have control over. So the more I talk to people leaders, certainly one of the questions I ask during my sessions is, what's your level of confidence right now in leading through change? Is it high, medium, or low? And for those who said it's high, the number one thing they say is why is experience. They've been through a number of changes. And it's less about the outcome of was that change quote unquote good or bad, because it's usually a mix. It was how they managed through it, how they managed their own emotions and their thoughts, the negative thoughts that enabled them to create greater peace sooner within themselves that then positively impacts their people. So the muscle being worked is very true. It's almost like this combination of a desensitization over time and not this reacting like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, because that leads to burnout. A study that the Mayo Clinic did to try to reduce burnout in emergency room settings with doctors and nurses found that those folks who were able to increase just by 10% doing more activities that brought them joy or peace, whether that was at home or professionally, their burnout rates went significantly less. We have control over that. Again, it comes back to this negativity bias. The negativity becomes a habit. Talking about what's wrong with people, bonding over negativity, it is a habit. So at a certain point, if we want to find all the things that are going to be wrong, there's plenty of data for that, professionally and in the world. I just talked to somebody yesterday who said, it doesn't feel like things are going in the right direction. If you feel like, listen, there's hope, there's possibility, there's many things that are happening, there's going to be a ton of data for that. So to answer your question, there is a limit. that people have. But if organizations and people leaders can just do a couple of things differently or better or more often, you're going to significantly increase your organization's, i.e., your people's capacity to go through changes. But it is this combination of not communicating the why, not giving people the opportunity for two-way dialogue, continuing to throw things at them that will burn your people out and your changes will fail, versus your changes will be difficult, but you'll have a better part of your audience or your people who will be more engaged because you're doing your best you can to get them out of fear. What all we're trying to do is to reduce the fear and uncertainty in little ways. Now, the organization themselves can do things, but even if your organization isn't doing some of those best things, you can use the book, you can use those guides, you can have the conversation, because leaders, for many reasons, want to avoid these tough conversations if they don't have all the answers, if they know they're going to be delivering bad news. But again, that's more what you need versus your people. So again, it's tolerating the discomfort, being curious, allowing people to have their reactions. It is a generous thing to do. When somebody has a negative reaction, you don't have to convince them out of it. You can simply say, yeah, it is tough. I get it. This doesn't seem like a good idea right now. Yeah, that's okay. Right? Because most will come around. They just need time. So that was a long answer to your question, but I don't think some of these things are going to stop. But I think what's in their control is, again, a couple of things we can tweak to make it easier for our people to manage this. But again, most organizations, they're an analytic network. We got to move forward. Here's a goal. And anything where someone raises a concern is viewed as you're slowing us down. And that is the biggest problem with organizations. If you are viewing somebody's reaction to you or what's happening in your organization as a direct input to your level of skill, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So in other words, organizations are a bottomless pit of need. It will never be enough. So this is where the self-care comes in. You're going to do the best you can. What is in your control as a people leader in terms of how you respond? You cannot control anybody's reaction, no matter how well you do this. And you will never be able to keep up. So it is, I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to prioritize what I can. And I'm going to have to get comfortable, more comfortable, tolerating the discomfort of not being able to get it all done. But that is not a reflection on my skill. That's just a reality.
Elizabeth, those are words of wisdom. I really enjoyed our conversation. Where can people find more about you and your work? You mentioned the book. I know it's on Amazon. It's called Forward. We'll put the link in the show notes. But what are other resources? Where should people go to learn more about your work?
So people can go to elizabethmorantransformation.com. You can hear about my work. If you're interested in bringing the work to your organization, would love to have a conversation. And also, just as a special gift to your listeners, if they want to connect with me on LinkedIn and they mention they heard me on this podcast, I'm happy to give them free access to the audiobook. You have to purchase the book. And if you do that, I'll give you a special link and then you get free access to the audiobook.
Wow, so you get 2 for 1. You get both the physical book and the audio book. That's fantastic.
And I do like to say the physical book's a good one to get simply because it's got those scripts. The audio book is great, but the scripts somehow don't translate as well when you have to have that tough conversation with people. So,
well, why have to choose between one or the other if you can have both? Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really enjoyed having you on. I think some really excellent insights. What I personally took away from that is, I think, one, that I think leaders should be gentle on themselves because they're going through the same thing. And also in terms of their expectations, there's no A+ when it comes to change leadership. right? Sometimes it's just good enough, right? You're not going to get everybody to embrace that. So I think that's a very human-centric and a humanistic perspective, and I think that's really helpful. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, be sure to subscribe, like, share, or comment. Until next time, let's make work matter.